how it all went south.
On November 14th, 1986, Jacqueline Lard left her children with a neighbor to work late at the Mount Vernon Realty office in Stafford, Virginia, while her husband, a DEA agent, was away on assignment. The next morning, a violent scene was discovered at the office with Jacqueline and her car missing. 2 days later, her body was found in a wooded area, and an autopsy revealed that she had died from blunt force trauma and asphyxiation. Investigators, including the FBI, launched a task force and developed a psychological profile suggesting the suspect was a younger white male with a history of resentment towards women. So despite efforts including rewards, composite sketches, and forensic analysis, the case went cold. But 16 years later, in 2002, the case was reopened. And in 2021, forensic genealogy linked the DNA from Jacqueline's murder to the unsolved killing of Amy Baker from 1989. This is the story of how the two cases brought investigators to find out who, in fact, had been responsible for the deaths of both of these women. It's also a case that, first built around a suspect profile, ended up being solved by science. I'm Jason Hoke, and that's Sean Kipe, and live from 800 East Studios in Atlanta, Georgia, this is How It All Went South. It was sometime after 9 p.m. on November 14th, 1986, when Jacqueline Lard left her two children in the safe care of a neighbor before she went back to the Mount Vernon Realty office to work late. The business had just closed, and her husband, a DEA agent, was away on assignment in Southeast Asia and wouldn't be back for a few days. It's now November 15th, 1986, the next day. Employees from nearby businesses were shocked by the scene that they came upon that morning. The scene outside the realty office indicated a horrific struggle. Both Jacqueline and her 1986 silver and pink Nissan Stanza were both missing. So Stafford County detectives, assisted by the Virginia State Police Crime Scene Unit and the FBI, processed the scene and collected blood and other evidence. The next day, November 16th, it's been 2 days since she was missing. Two teenage boys, while playing in a wooded area near Railroad Avenue in Woodbridge, discovered her body beneath a pile of discarded carpet at a makeshift dump. Tire tracks were found on a dirt road leading to where Jacqueline's body was found. Now, an autopsy ruled out stabbing or gunshots as the cause of death, and there was also no evidence that she had been sexually assaulted. However, it was determined that she died from blunt force trauma and asphyxiation. The FBI spokesman at the time, Jim Mull, said, "We have no leads, no trace of her car or her. She was leaving her office and locking up, and there's evidence of a very bad physical struggle." Now, initially, the FBI became involved on the assumption that the abductor might have taken Jacqueline out of state. The agency continued to assist the case at the request of local law enforcement officials, creating a task force combining the efforts of the Sheriff's Office, Prince William County Police Department, the FBI, and the DEA. So everyone was on this case for sure. By November 29th, 1986, the FBI's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crimes in Quantico, they created a preliminary psychological profile of the killer that suggested that he was a white male. He was likely several years younger than Jacqueline, with at least average intelligence. So I'm going to read to you this profile that they developed. And I just couldn't believe. I'm curious what your reaction is. This is definitely a sign of the times. And we're going to actually get into profiling and all kinds of really interesting techniques that they used at the time and why they used those. So they didn't have any, they weren't using DNA at the time or really had any specific scientific ties to this case. So this is what the investigators came up with about their still unknown suspect. And it's detailed. I don't know how they came up with this. He had likely completed high school, and worked in semi-skilled or manual labor, which explained his above-average upper body strength. The profile further described him as probably single, struggling to form long-term relationships with women, harboring resentment towards them, and blaming women for his personal failures. It goes on. His interactions with women were likely marked by extensive staring and macho-type approaches. Investigators believe that this wasn't the first time he would have had physical confrontation with a woman, and those who knew him would have suspected he was capable of such a crime. It goes on. The killer was thought to be familiar with both the office and the woods where Jacqueline's body was found, and likely lived or worked in those areas. Probably resided in lower-income housing areas, unless he was living with someone else. What's your reaction to hearing that?
It's very detailed for profiling. The only thing I can think of is they really have an idea, a picture in their minds of who this is, and they're almost describing that person. But there's no suspects yet, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, let me.
Do you know what I mean? Like, maybe there's not an official suspect, but they have some idea of who, because it's really specific.
Marked by extensive staring. Like, who builds that into a profile?
Yeah.
Macho type interactions. Like at some point, every guy ever has got some sort of macho type. It doesn't make sense to me. Like this, there's some generalizations here that don't make sense for a case. He's probably single. He doesn't have good relationships with women. Well, obviously, he just killed a woman. Like, he's not like the nicest person in the world. Like, how is this helpful to anything that you're doing?
Yeah, but I think if you look at the profiling of certain people who have committed crimes, I mean, I'm trying to think of an example, like John Wayne Gacy, right? Like, if you were profiling and you knew anything about the crimes he'd committed, it's probably likely that he wasn't in a relationship or he wasn't married. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can sort of deduce those things.
But if they're all this way, doesn't it just feel like a generic approach to a profile? That's the thing that bothered me. And I think, we're living in this era where, I can track everything from, GPS on my phone to the cell phone ping tower, the cell tower ping to social media footprints, to obviously DNA and blood and kind of all this stuff. It just feels like this is something from 100 years ago, not something that was happening in 1986. Like, it is crazy to me. Like, they could actually think that they would find the person based on this profile. Like, it's like I'm reading a book from the 1800s. That's my reaction to this.
Oh, when did they start really profiling people, though?
Well,
I'm glad you asked.
I'm glad you asked, because I really wanted to go as much as I could in a single episode like this. I think maybe you've mentioned Robert Ressler before as one of the original modern day profilers. Anyway, he is one of the guys that started this in, I think it was around the 70s or so. And his goal was to identify characteristics that would make it easier to tie a certain profile to a case. And the main person that you may have heard of is John E. Douglas, who pioneered the use of criminal profiling. And he's the inspiration for Mindhunter, the David Fincher series on Netflix. He was also involved in the Atlanta child murders and the profiling that was done there. And, even at the time, the profiling of who is this person as a loner or whatever, it actually kind of worked when you think about who they actually ended up nailing in Wayne Williams, but it was still kind of all they had, right?
Yeah, but I think especially a serial killer, most of them, you could say that they're a loner, and that would end up being true.
Right.
There's very few, and there are some who have a family, and they just have this whole second life, this other,
But you know what I'm saying about, like, it just feels like it's like there's nothing there. And it's just weird statements about staring. Mom.
Compulsive starer.
Mom, Shane's staring at me, Anyway, so I decided to go a little bit deeper on criminal profiling, and I just wanted to understand exactly what it is and what are the characteristics behind it. So What is criminal profiling? It is a technique used that uses psychology, behavior, and pattern recognition to identify potential criminals, involving analyzing evidence and clues from the crime scene, and so on and so forth. And so John Douglas developed new investigative methods for using criminal profiling to hunt down, like you said, serial killers, sex offenders, and other violent criminals. So for those specific cases, I think you're right. It makes a lot of sense, right? Like there's a specific pattern to a serial killer.
Yeah, and I think there's probably to certain types of crime, even not a serial killer, to certain types of crimes through history and over time, I'm sure there are certain traits that those, criminals have that when you're building a profile, you can pull from, you know what I mean? There's certain things, if a victim is a female and there are certain things, she's sexually assaulted or, sometimes, again, we've talked about different things. Strangulation versus, face being disfigured. There's certain, you can look through history at people who've been convicted of those crimes that you can pull from what shared traits do they have. Yeah. So there's got to be some, I don't think that they were just pulling this stuff out of the air going like, he probably stares at women.
Before you come to me, I'm no expert in this. I'm just going deep on the research.
No, I know. I'm
just saying, like, curious about how this all works, right? The Roman
experts out there,
the Roman Colosseum, as I like to call it.
Yeah.
So I actually wanted to understand what the FBI's process was, and it involves 7 different elements. The evaluation of the criminal act itself makes sense. Comprehensive evaluation of the specifics of the crime scene makes sense. Comprehensive analysis of the victim. The evaluation of preliminary police reports, obvious. Evaluation of the medical examiner's autopsy protocol. The development of the profile with critical offender characteristics. And finally, investigative suggestions predicated on construction of the profile. And so they're using all the things, right? They're using the evidence at the scene, the state of the victim, kind of all the things they've collected to try and build a profile.
Yeah.
So it's not just a crapshoot. You're looking at a specific line of things each time you do that. So, it makes me wonder, think about all the falsely accused and wrongfully convicted people that maybe these type of techniques was applied to. And I point out wrongfully convicted, but I actually think it's also interesting to talk about the falsely accused.
Yeah.
So, hey, I saw a guy that looked like a guy, and all of a sudden they were being wheeled down to the station, and they didn't have anything to do with it, but they get a little bit of a scarlet A on them, right, for maybe being a suspect. And how many times do we drag those names into the media? They never make it to trial, but somehow this dude's a creep.
It's fun. I'm working on putting together a story right now that is about exactly that, but it went to trial.
Yeah.
And, things like that happen. I mean, it can, whether you're convicted or not, because this person wasn't convicted, fortunately, but it still ruined the person's life.
Right.
Just like you said, that scarlet A. I mean, it.
Right. I'm working on this case in Hawaii where even though wrongful conviction's been overturned, there's still this, Shane knows this too, this skepticism of, well, I don't know, it seemed pretty guilty at the time and you're never going to change our minds no matter what you tell us.
It's so right here kind of proves our point, because those 2 stories that we just talked about share already a couple traits that we could, if we were using that method of profiling, we could, you know what I mean? We could kind of profile just from that. So that, kind of answers a little bit of your question anyway.
Yeah, and I found this article from 2019 from Dr. Brianna Fox, and she asked the questions, is criminal profiling dead? Should it be? And she was part of a landmark study about the effectiveness of criminal profiling. They marked 426 publications that discussed or highlighted profiling from the years 1976 to 2016. And here are a few highlights from that study. The process broke it into 2 groups. So some profilers using a more scientific process involving statistical analysis of data on crimes and the responsible offenders, stats, data, real great science and all that stuff, and others using a more clinical process that will ring true based on what you've already heard on this profile that we were talking about earlier with Jacqueline Lard, where profiles were developed using what FBI profilers described as, quote, experience, intuition, and educated guesswork. In fact, our study found that over half of the profiling publications used no statistical analyses. So you're getting these profiles based on this, he says it right here, educated guesswork, intuition. I'm that detective or that, like I got a gut feeling
I got
about
a gut
this.
feeling about it.
Yeah, and this was what happened over the course of 1976 to 2016. Over half of those cases were based on not the stats version. It's the old school way of doing things.
Yeah, you could make the argument that it goes way back further.
Way
than
back.
that. I mean, just because you're not considering it profiling officially, I mean, what does a detective or a police officer go on sometimes gut instinct or intuition from experience in the job?
Yeah, they got the light next to their desk at 10 o'clock at night trying to crack the case. And like, let me drive back out there one more time.
Yeah.
So they asked police to evaluate all 192 profiles created by the FBI from 1971 to 1981. And the police said that just 17% of the profiles directly aided in the identification of a suspect, but another 17% felt that the profiles were not useful at all. So it really wasn't even helping them to create these profiles. Then they conducted their own experiment and trained a police department on the statistical analysis method to drive solving cases. So they said, we're going to train you and have you use this more stat-driven approach. And what they found is that they solved over 260% more crimes than the forces that didn't employ these methods. So it's all about, kind of your approach. So it's a lot more than that gut feeling kind of an.
Sure, yeah.
So
yeah.
I feel like that profile felt more gut feeling or intuitive when I read it back. It wasn't based on any hard data. And as you can imagine, there's a whole group of pop culture experiences that are also driving some of this. Again, Mindhunter, and just as one example. Do you remember the show The Profiler that ran on TV?
Yeah.
Where you've got this profiler. It was 1996 to 2000. Did you realize that was supposed to be portraying the FBI's Violent Crimes Task Force right here in Atlanta?
Never watched it, but I know what it is.
Yeah, I didn't realize that was Atlanta. But it was one of those, like, we've got the profile. We're going to, it's like a kind of like a Law and Order episode, but based on this, the profiler is going to crack it. And they always do at the end of the day.
Sure.
So, okay, well, we're going to take a break and get back into Jacqueline's case right after this. Okay, we're back. It is now December 18th, 1986, and Jacqueline's Nissan Stanza was finally found abandoned in the parking lot of the Bryn Mawr Park Apartments in Fairfax County. Before finding it, there were reports that the car had been spotted in D.C. at least twice after Lard's body had been found, and in New York and New Jersey, but those weren't confirmed. Now, using a new technique, so we're in 1987 now, and a new technique was used to analyze blood splatter by the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the BCI, and they were able to determine that Jacqueline was standing when she was struck 3 times with a blunt object. Did you watch The Staircase?
Yeah, you asked me that before.
Yeah, like the splatter at the bottom of the stairs, and then they go into the FBI lab to try and recreate it.
Yeah, so we talked about Making a Murderer too, where they did that, and it's so interesting how they can replicate that and what they can learn from recreations in the lab.
Yeah,
it's amazing, honestly.
We're kind of stepping through time with some of these things, right? Like criminal profiles, and now we're starting to get some of these blood splatter techniques. And as I was searching for this, I was just typing in blood splatter FBI, and it's like salaries for blood splatter technician. And I'm like, wow, that's a very specific job to have.
Sure. Yeah.
So they find that she was standing at the time of when she was murdered or attacked. It doesn't really tell you all that much, though. Like in this case, it's not at the bottom of a staircase. It's just, it didn't really help them that much.
No, I think it would tell you a lot.
Yeah.
I think it could tell you a lot.
I don't think it led anywhere, though.
If that's the only thing that you know about a case or a crime scene, then maybe not, other than determining the manner of death or how they were killed, what they were killed with.
It's interesting. Yeah, she was standing when she was bludgeoned. That's what the report said. That's what the newspaper report said.
Yeah.
So not much to go on. So they continue to be frustrated, and the real estate agents around that group raised a $20,000 reward to help find her killer. They had a 24-hour hotline set up for people to call in with information. And this is weird, but the task force began to feel that the suspect either lived at the apartment complex where Jacqueline's car was found or had friends living there. No reason given whatsoever, but they just felt like that person probably lived there at an apartment complex nearby because that's where they found her car. They just had a feeling. It's just a strange thing to put out there in the news, but whatever.
Well, okay, but that they never put everything in the news that they know.
Yeah, true, but why put that out there?
I who knows?
Yeah, scare the guy off, I guess.
Yeah, maybe.
All right, so we're going to show you a picture. They released 2 composite sketches created from 2 witness testimonies. One had seen maybe someone in the woods where her body was found, an eyewitness. And so they said the suspect is still believed to be a white man with a medium to slightly heavy build and strong upper body strength. So why don't you zoom in on that, Shane, like a little bit closer with these sketches. What is that?
Like a third
Well,
race.
yeah, the one on the right could be a man or a woman. I mean, from that picture.
Yeah.
And the one on the left just looks very bored. Be on the lookout for a very bored-looking man.
Right. This is in the newspaper. I mean,
Well, what do you? Yeah, I mean, if you've got nothing else to go on, but I mean, yeah, it's. Why would you ever? They're not going to be wearing the hat all the time, so you know what I mean. Like, why put the picture of someone wearing a hat, a baseball cap?
That's embarrassing to see that. That is absolutely embarrassing.
Show what their hair looks like would be my.
That's
my
just
point.
that I'm like it's really cringy that is like the investigators would put that out there. So again, here we go again. So this opens up another kind of category. We've talked about this. Eyewitness testimonies have proven to be unreliable, right? As I researched this, I found this article, How Reliable is Eyewitness Testimony? In the American Psychological Association that references Arlo Olson and the Fairbanks Four.
Yeah. Wow. They reference him. Yeah. Because he changed his story 4 or 5 times.
So the expert witness in that case, if you'll remember, Dr. Jeffrey Loftus testified, seeing someone from 450 feet away is like sitting high in the center field bleachers in Yankee Stadium and looking across the ballpark at another individual sitting in the stands behind home plate. That was the Fairbanks 4 case, right?
Yeah. I'm trying to remember now what the actual distance was.
450 feet.
Was it 400?
Yeah, he was using that specifically
okay, that's
as the example.
Yeah, it's and that and there's so much more to that story where he was pressured from the prosecution and you run into that whole thing when it comes to a witness. I mean, not to say a witness can't go back on the statement that they gave initially or the information they gave, but once you get into it, again, in that case being such a prime example, he was pressured and then he wanted to do the right thing, so he recanted, and then he was pressured again, and then he wanted to do the right thing and he recanted. I mean, it
all adds up, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, just the eyewitness testimony, especially at distance, is just highly, highly unreliable is what we're finding. And a couple things here. Distance creates blurriness. So you think you see something that you don't really see. And then there's another part, like there's a whole list of things that they spell out in this article, but they also talk about police lineups, where sometimes the police are already have a theory, already trying to wheel someone in, and they're already want to make a conclusion based on what the answer is.
Oh yeah, look,
You know,
I learned from a police officer, and this was regarding a 6-pack lineup, right? So they'll show 6 pictures,
yeah,
and say, does this any of these men look familiar? And they were saying that they were actually trained here in Georgia, and I don't know if they still do this, or I don't even think they do those anymore.
lineups.
The little lineup where it's printed out.
Yeah.
But he was saying, there are all kinds of tricks of the trade that they would have if they had someone in mind, where like you'd do it where it was kind of darker and you'd shine a flashlight on it, and they would
Really?
yeah. That was actually the Chapel case.
Right.
Where one of the officers that I interviewed told me that, and it was, that you could focus the light more on a certain picture, just little things that oh yeah, that leads the eye to a certain place.
So I've taken a couple off ramps on this main story, but again, talking about criminal profiling, talking about eyewitness testimonies, these terrible sketches. I mean, there's a lot that wasn't good about a lot of these things.
This reminds me of, you've seen My Cousin Vinny, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So My Cousin Vinny, like at the end, like I think that's actually what wins the case when it's like 200 yards away, and he says, you were looking through a screen that was dirty, hadn't been cleaned forever, and there was a tree, and and it was nighttime, and it was the old woman or something, and he holds up his fingers at the end of the courtroom. And I mean, like that's real. Someone gets something in their mind, or it's that person must be guilty. Yes, that's what I saw. It had to have been him.
Or you can be talked into believing something.
Sure.
Which, again, we're not covering it in this specifically, but false confessions, right?
Yeah.
Being walked into a false confession on something that you never did, but somehow you've agreed that you did it.
Yeah.
That is
crazy,
but it happens.
If you think it's going to help you more at a certain point to admit to it and take some lesser charge than to keep fighting and risk life in prison or death penalty or whatever it could be. Yeah.
So after the break, when we come back, we are going to talk about how this case with Jacqueline Lard intersects with another case and ultimately solves both of them. So we'll be right back after this. Okay, so we're back. It's now 2021, and while a Stafford County detective was looking at genetic genealogy to identify Lard's killer, they ran across another set of detectives that were submitting their own DNA evidence for another case from 1989. Now, that case was the case of Amy Baker, who was age 18 at the time. She had just passed her GED, and she found herself headed home to Stafford County after visiting family in Falls Church on March 29th, 1989. But she'd never make it. Instead, a Virginia state trooper found her abandoned car by the side of the road, but Baker was nowhere in sight. A few days later, her family found her body covered with leaves in a wooded area near I-95. There was a large shirt wrapped around her neck, and she had been strangled. Quote, when they found her body, they tried unsuccessfully to flag down a motorist and eventually caught the attention of an officer sitting in his cruiser at a light on nearby Backlick Road. So this family was very upset because they actually went out off the interstate and found the body themselves. They were upset that the police had not done enough to look for her.
Yeah, that's mud on your face, big time.
Brutal.
Yeah.
I mean, the theory was that she had run out of gas. Her car had run out of gas on the highway, and the person who picked her up was the one that killed her. And so Amy Baker's aunt insisted that police did not look hard enough.
Clearly.
And she said, quote, there might not have been anything they could have done to save Amy, but they might have been able to have done something to save her mother from finding her.
Yeah, oof. I can't imagine that, man. That reminds me of another story that I looked into where the family, the police just weren't doing enough, and they were Native American. and they went and interrogated a suspect themselves and got a confession, got the guy to break down and admit and take the family to where this family's family member was killed, and remains were discarded. Can you imagine? It's bad enough to just find that out, what happened to someone, but for you to get to the point of feeling like the police or whoever is not doing enough, and you step up and I'm going to do this myself.
I can't imagine.
And you do. And you actually, and you're successful in that. Like,
wow.
That's horrible.
Yeah.
Yeah. And on a lot of levels.
So this was, I went back through the archives of Amy Baker's case, and this is another cold case. Hopeless. They would have the anniversary, kind of newspaper postings, which happens. It's been 8 years. It's been 10 years. It's been 16 years. Sean, how this goes with missing persons that you've tracked, with Justin Gaines. And it's really hard when those anniversaries hit. And so they were without hope for sure. And so what happened is, the DNA matched. The samples from Jacqueline Lard and from Amy Baker matched a suspect. And the guy that had been doing the genetic genealogy was the one that went out and arrested the guy, which was kind of cool, I think. And they found him. Ultimately, they issued a search warrant for the DNA to confirm, from a man named Elroy Harrison. He was age 65. I just have to say, he looks nothing like the sketches. He doesn't fit the profile. There's not anything even remotely close to that initial profile that authorities had developed. He's a black man. And I mean, they were just
for one, he's not white.
Right. He definitely was not white. And they they completely missed it. I mean, yeah, the sketch. Pull that sketch up.
Yeah. Not a lot of black men with that hair on the right there.
So they're still working on.
But they were obviously looking for the wrong person. But I mean that happens. Let's be honest.
It does. But I just I don't want.
It's easy for us to be critical. I think you know what I mean sometimes. But
no. But what's even to me and I'm saying it's the moral of the story here. But as we've talked about the evolution of investigative techniques and what we had and what we have now, I'm not saying that there should be any unsolved cases. Like you can't bring that down to zero, but it is incredible the power that we have in our hands with DNA. And like cases are being overturned and convictions are being thrown out every single day, it seems like.
Yeah.
And the techniques of the past are just not being used anymore, and I'm thankful for that. Like,
well, yeah,
a good thing, right?
Yeah, it's why go backwards? I mean, I think there's still some things that are I don't want to say. I think there's probably gut instincts that still come into play.
You're a good detective. And this is based on
there's human nature that
20 years of experience about like what makes a case. But I think,
but you're right.
But again, reading through that original criminal profile of this guy, of
you have blood at the crime scene,
staring, and the macho type attitudes, and the like loner thing. It's like such a generic thing, and even eyewitness accounts of like, yeah, I think I saw a guy that had long hair and was wearing black clothes with boots.
But you know what? I'll say this: that could have been accurate, and maybe there was a guy who matches that description that just happened to come by the crime scene,
which is what I think happened.
Yeah, a moment after. So that person would need to be checked into rightfully, and so I get it. I get why they would go for that path if that's the only thing you have, right?
Yeah, I guess my point is that.
But it doesn't mean that he's guilty.
Right,
yeah.
Right. But I think for me, it's like we don't throw everything away that we've ever learned or every technique that we've used because we've only got DNA. Now we have DNA and blood splatter experts, and we've got all this great science and technology and data. We don't throw all the old stuff away. We use experiences as detective, as investigators, sometimes as podcasters, right? We have our own instincts to be able to follow leads that aren't being solved by detectives or police or whatever. And so it's not a perfect science, but my reaction here is we have a lot of power in our hands now to be able to solve more cases, to have less cold cases, and have, victims, and families brought to justice, and the perpetrators, thrown in jail for the crimes that they actually did commit based on these real stats. And to me, that's exciting.
Do you think, though, with the advancements in DNA and all these things that we have now, but also the fact that people who are committing crimes are more aware of those techniques as well, that they can plan a little better, or are better at cleaning up a crime scene? Because, and I mean, it's a serious question. So if I were to commit a crime, a murder right now, which I haven't, but if I'm to commit a crime or a murder, I know certain things. I mean, there's some things you just can't get away from. I mean, if you leave your you blood drop and you don't know about it, but
right.
But I know things to look out for and to plan for, or if it's a heat of the moment kind of thing, like there are certain things that you would, just from what's in the media, just from what you read about in the news, the way cold cases are cracked, the way murder cases are cracked, you know what I mean? Like, does that sort of push back on the advances a little bit?
It also means that you have to be a really sophisticated criminal to pull these things off.
Sure,
too.
yeah.
So like you really have to want to murder someone or multiple people and have a specific way to get away with it. So what is your motivation to go
and expect to get away? Yeah.
Do, instead of just like coming up to someone and, strangling them, for example, and it's not just DNA that is from blood. So sweat.
Oh yeah.
Sweat
Spit.
on a shirt, spit, sperm, all these things are leaving traces of your DNA, from hairs to whatever. It's really hard to get away with that these days. It is. And you don't need much of it either.
Oh, no. Trace DNA, or touch DNA. Yeah, you only need a tiny, tiny bit. But
we've talked about the labs, right, that have now the tools to be able to go deep on that,
Yeah, it's I mean, we're definitely in a better place now than we've ever been as far as having technology to solve crimes. And I can't remember who I was talking to, an investigator recently, a while ago, and he said that same thing to me. He said it's really hard to get away with murder now. It's not impossible,
right.
But aside from physical evidence at a crime scene, think about this. If there was a crime committed in this studio right now, and whoever committed the crime left this building, how many cameras, or doorbell cameras,
didn't even bring those up?
Going to be between here and wherever that person's going, or traffic lights, cameras at traffic intersections, or businesses along the way, whatever it is. I mean, that's just one aspect, right?
And even the GPS in your car. So it's not even the GPS
on your phone.
I mean, if you have a Tesla, you're probably using their navigation system, and it's keeping a record of all that stuff. Like I tell my kids, like Snapchat says 24 hours and it's deleted, but nothing's ever deleted.
Yeah. Well, and you told me too, like Sirius XM in your car,
right?
They can GPS track you by that, which I was
still haven't gotten over that.
I still haven't gotten over that, because not, whatever, but I mean, it's just, that is crazy to me, because I did not know that. And how many other things, everybody knows their phone tracks you, right? I mean, you turn off Google's, do not track. Yeah, right. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
it's like
come on. There's probably 8 other apps in
like
anyone's
the
phone.
incognito mode in Google Chrome doesn't actually make you 100% incognito.
Well, it didn't. I don't know if it does now, but it didn't.
Yeah.
And that was part of a lawsuit or whatever. So yeah, you're always being tracked. Don't commit a crime.
Let me leave you with this. I am 100% fully convinced that Wayne Williams was responsible for most, if not all, of the murders around the Atlanta child murders, having spent so much time on that case. And what's interesting is they built a profile. He was close and adjacent, but there was never any cameras or GPS he was very, very suspicious on that front, right? And so I've listened to him. I've watched him. We've talked to all the detectives, the investigators. He's taken lie detectors tests, all those things. But the DNA from that case is in that lab that we've talked about, the FBI lab, and is being looked at right now. It was sent to the lab about 3 or 4 years ago. We don't actually know what the result is. I don't know what's taking so long. That being said, yes, I know.
Yeah.
What if I was proven wrong?
Sure.
What if, as strongly as I feel about that case and him being the one that did it, through overwhelming evidence and just suspicious behavior, what if the DNA came back and cleared him?
Yeah,
How would I look, right?
Well, yeah, it's totally possible. And I mean, again, that's the case I was talking about earlier today with you. I mean, that it's a story I'm working on, and it's the same thing that 30 something years later, almost 35 years later, and it was this, this guy's guilty. He had confessed. He knew things about the crime that only the killer would know. I mean, just all these different things that added up to this. And you've said you did it.
Yeah.
35 years later, DNA is tested, and he wasn't. And it was someone else, and that person was arrested. So it happens.
And it's highly unlikely that the DNA will come back and say that it wasn't Wayne Williams. But if it does say it wasn't him, I kind of have to check myself. Was I making an assumption based on race, or was I making an assumption based on media bias or coverage, or not having? I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. Like, I've actually never thought about this until our discussion today. Like, what if that one came back the other way? I'm not sure how I would react, or like, what was my bias?
It's really hard to walk into a case, even if it's not a closed case and there's not someone in prison. If it's a cold case, but there are suspects that have been like the number one suspect, to walk into it and you can say to yourself, I'm going to be as unbiased as I can, and truly doing that to the best of your ability. But it's really hard at a certain point, especially if evidence starts stacking up. You tend to catch yourself falling into that way of thinking.
You do.
And there's probably a reason for that.
Yep.
Why do all the detectives, why do all those people believe he did? Well, there are reasons for it. It's not just let's pick some guy who fits the mold. But until they're proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, you still have to reserve that part of yourself that goes, okay, well, I have to be open to it not being this person and it being someone else.
Yeah, so I think to kind of end on this note, we'd love to hear from you about your thoughts. Understanding, of course, that each of the topics that we dove into could probably be their own separate podcast, and libraries and libraries of research. And a lot of this is just, we've touched so many cases and had various reactions to kind of all these things and how cases are investigated, who's doing the investigating, what is the evidence, and what makes sense. I think we ask these questions all the time. So we want to hear from you, get your thoughts about what works and what doesn't work here, what we got right and wrong, and just get your opinions on, kind of where do we go from here moving forward. So thanks to everyone. Thanks to you, Sean. And we'll see you next time on How It All Went South.